Hello everyone and welcome to How to Create Greener Digital Products and Services. I'm Fiona Ross-Jones, founder of Make Impact. We're a West Yorkshire agency helping growing companies to lead with purpose and make their business a force for good. We help organisations to create authentic purpose, measurable impact and develop opportunities for the growth of their business. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Tom Greenwood. He is the co-founder and managing director of Whole Grain Digital. They're a sustainable web design agency and B Corp with clients including UNICEF, London School of Economics and Network Rail. They are leaders in web sustainability and performance, helping shift the industry to a zero carbon future. They're creators of their Sustainable Web Manifesto and the website Carbon Calculator. Hello, Tom. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
Great. So I'm just going to give you an overview of the event session today. So I'm going to start off with a short presentation as an introduction to the topic. We're then going to have an interview with Tom to find out more. And then he's going to move on to a presentation going through the key design principles of how to create greener digital products and services. And then we're going to finish up the session with 3 top tips on how you can get started. We really appreciate your feedback, and we're going to give you a link to a feedback form at the end of the session. And if you're happy to complete that, then we will send you the resources from the session. Right, so without further ado, I'm going to start with my presentation. So now more than ever, people want to buy from, work for and invest in companies that are making a positive difference in the world. So much so that the Edelman Brand Trust in 2020 report reported that 80% of people now want brands to solve society's problems. And companies are responding, they're taking action, they're adopting social purpose, zero carbon pledges, waste reduction, sustainability practices, circular economy business models, and some are taking a whole company approach and doing business for good. So business for good is using your business to have a positive impact on society in a way that's led by a social or environmental purpose, integrated throughout your organisation, creating a positive impact for staff, the community, the environment and clients, and aligned with your business strategy. Who's doing it? Well, there are far too many to mention. There is a real growing movement of companies that are having a positive difference in the world. I've listed a few that are leading the way here, including companies like Patagonia, Brewdog, Unilever, Ella's Kitchen, Cafe Direct, WeTransfer, Bulb Energy and more. And these companies want to be working with organisations that have similar values to them and contracting with organisations that can help them to achieve their social and environmental aims. And this isn't just the right thing to do. There is a huge amount of studies and reports demonstrating the business case for this, and this is a really nice example of how it can benefit your business. So Unilever's purpose-led sustainable living brands are now growing 69% faster than the rest of the business and delivering 75% of the company's growth. So why is this relevant to creating greener digital products and services? Well, if the internet were a country, it would be the 6th largest consumer of energy on the planet. And now with COVID, where we're seeing more and more people spending time online, this is going to increase. Companies need to be considering more than just going paper-free and becoming paper-free offices. They need to start looking at their digital footprint. And again, as I said before, this isn't just a nice thing to do. There are several benefits to your business in developing greener digital products and services, including a positive brand reputation, improved SEO, better conversion rates, faster load times, enhanced user experience, and increased accessibility. I am really pleased to be joined by Tom Greenwood, the Managing Director of Whole Grain Digital, and we're going to move on now to the interview part of the session. So Tom, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start off with the classic question, which is, can you tell us about your business and why you started it?
Yeah, sure. So Wholegrain Digital is a WordPress design and development agency in London, started in 2007 by my wife and I. And we really started it partly out of frustration in the sort of mid-2000s of lots and lots of eco brands coming up and struggling to sort of enter the mainstream and compete sort of on a marketing level, brand marketing level with mainstream brands. And I strongly believe that if we're going to solve kind of the world's environmental problems, we've got to make sustainability mainstream. And I also strongly believe that business needs to be kind of at the heart of those solutions, because it's also at the heart of the problems. So Wholegrain Digital sort of really started as a bit of an experiment to see, could we actually run a sustainable business ourselves, rather than sitting on the sidelines kind of complaining about other businesses and how they're doing things. And it's been a real journey of challenges in terms of, you know, seeing like what does sustainability really mean, and the challenges of just running a business in general.
Thank you very much. So can you tell us a bit more about digital sustainability and why it matters?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you mentioned that sort of headline statistic of sort of in terms of energy consumption, the internet is like sort of the sixth energy hungriest country in the world, and that sort of roughly translates into carbon emissions as well. And we're at a point in history where we need to be decarbonizing our economy, you know, really, really rapidly. And digital is a part of that. Digital can provide a lot of solutions that are much more efficient than sort of, you know, the alternatives, such as video conferencing is more efficient than, you know, getting in the car and driving to an industrial estate to go to work. But at the same time, digital itself has a huge carbon footprint just because of the vast amount of electricity that it uses in data centers, in transmission networks, and in end user devices. And at a time when we're trying to bring emissions down, emissions from the internet and sort of all of the things that go with the internet, all the devices, are actually rising really, really rapidly. And there's all sorts of estimates around that. But, you know, they sort of range from somewhere between 10 and 25% of global emissions by, you know, 2030, which would be insane. And we're currently at about 2%, which might not sound like much, but it's roughly the same as the aviation industry.
Wow, that is crazy. So let's have a look. How good is the typical website? And if it's not good, why isn't it?
Sure. So if we look at websites specifically, if we take the average website on the internet, then using our carbon calculator, it produces about 3 grams of CO2 for every time somebody visits that website. And that scales up a lot. You know, some websites have fairly low traffic, probably not a big deal, but a lot of websites have, you know, thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of visitors per month. So that can scale up really, really fast. And the reason that it's big is really down to sort of 2 main things. One is partly sort of the carbon intensity of the actual web hosting, and, you know, data centers use huge amounts of electricity, and a lot of them are just taking sort of standard grid electricity, and some of them in parts of the world where they're intentionally built in places with cheap electricity, which often means that they're using coal. But also on the sort of software side, as the internet's got faster, web designers and developers have, for lack of a better word, have got lazier, because we don't need to think as much about how long our web pages are going to take to load. If the internet keeps getting faster, we can keep throwing in more kind of libraries of code, bigger images without optimizing them, and these sorts of things. And the users don't necessarily notice because their internet connection is faster than it was last year and the year before. But the actual amount of data that's being transferred to achieve the same end goal is increasing year on year.
Mm. And can you tell us a bit more about, so you are the creator of the website Carbon Calculator, and for anyone who hasn't used this, it's an incredible tool, and we'll give you the link in the comments in a bit, but basically you can type in any web address and it'll tell you how good your website is and how much carbon it's producing, and also tips in how to reduce that as well. But as the creator of it, can you tell us a bit more about how it works?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, I'll say that my team did a lot of the work in creating it. I didn't do it single-handedly, so credit where it's due. But the way that it works is essentially we're using the primary metric as data transfer. So we look at the amount of data that gets transferred over the internet for every page load, and then we factor in adjustments for the number of repeat visits, because repeat visitors actually use less data, and we also factor in the energy source of the data center. So we use a database of hosting providers that are committed to using green energy, and then we essentially we convert the amount of data into an energy figure, and then we convert the energy figure into an amount of carbon dioxide. And obviously we're doing this on a sort of average level for the public carbon calculator. So we're using sort of the global average energy, the global carbon intensity of electricity, because people using the carbon calculator could be anywhere in the world. But we also have a sort of an internal version, which is much more nuanced, and we can tailor different factors. So we know that, like, okay, this website is targeted at the UK market or things like that. And we can get a bit more precise. Brilliant.
It's an incredible tool. I've used it myself and been a bit disappointed by the outcome. And I am more carbon efficient than most websites. I'd need to definitely put some work into it. So it's a brilliant tool to understand where you stand and what you can do.
Yeah, I mean, just one little thing to add to that. We're going to be updating it soon with new data. So the internet, although websites get less efficient year on year, the internet gets more efficient year on year. So data centers get more energy efficient, the telecoms networks get more efficient. So we will be updating it soon with data for sort of 2020, 2021, which, even if you've done nothing, will make your results look better. It's not a reason not to do anything about it.
We'll do some reactions as well. I will take some actions as well. But no, that's really interesting to know, like, yeah, how that's figured out, and that, you know, that there is that kind of transparency around that. It is really important, I think, because I think there is a lot of confusion around how carbon is calculated. We were just having a conversation before this session around that as well, and it can be difficult, but making it clearer and more transparent with clear ways that people can take action is really important.
Yeah.
So why should business leaders, designers and developers care about reducing their carbon?
I mean, I think there's two levels to this. I mean, there's the basic level, which is that we all need to do something about this. It is a sort of an urgent global problem, and it's not going to be solved by governments alone or charities alone. So it needs everybody, however small you think your drop in the ocean is, needs everybody to be doing something about it. But on the other hand, you know, I realize that people need other reasons to invest time and sometimes money in doing things. And on the website level specifically, there's like real benefits to pursuing sustainability. So when we introduce this as a lens in the design process, so thinking about like the design decisions we're making and the technical decisions we're making through a sort of sustainability lens, rather than just a user experience lens or a, you know, conversion rate lens and all of these sorts of things that we normally think of in web projects. When we added sustainability, what we found was that we ended up making websites that were more accessible, that were much, much faster to load. And then, you know, other benefits around that in terms of sort of improving user experience and benefits in search engine rankings and things like that. So it's sort of a catch-all factor that even if you didn't care about it, if you actually just introduce it into your design process as a question for every design decision, like, will this make it more or less sustainable? It actually can really help just make better web products in general.
Great. And what about kind of outside of kind of websites, so, and thinking a bit more about other types of digital products, how does that compare?
So with other types of web products, you have a lot less control over them than you do with your own website. But the one thing you do have control over is just choosing which products you use. So, if you're selecting an email provider or you're selecting a video conferencing provider or something like that, then obviously you can look at those providers and see, like, do they have like a serious environmental policy? Do they have a commitment to using renewable energy in their data centers? And also look at like the performance of those applications, because web performance, as in the speed, is generally quite closely correlated with sustainability. So even if they don't tell you anything, if one is really slow and one is really fast, there's a good chance the fast one, which is more enjoyable to use anyway, there's a good chance the fast one is more energy efficient.
Great, thank you. And so how do you work with and support your clients with the process of considering this?
So very gently is the answer. Some clients, prioritize sustainability a lot more than others. I mean, in general, at Whole Grain, we try to work with organizations that have sort of positive environmental or social mission, but nevertheless, like they all have their priorities for why they're doing a web project, and that priority is not normally sustainability. So it's very much kind of an add-on rather than the core objective of the project. But we just talk to them about, introduce them to the topic, introduce them to like the types of things we'd be thinking about in the design process, and how those decisions that they're involved in making, particularly like this kind of the aesthetic decisions that we're making, can have a real impact, and sort of set the scene at the beginning and explain to them how actually, it can have other benefits for them if they get on board with this and work with us and thinking about it. And likewise, with the hosting provider, we can choose a hosting provider that's got a commitment to using renewable energy. And often that's an easy win. Even if you don't change anything else, we can often work with them to move their hosting provider somewhere else if need be.
So it's providing levels of awareness and choice, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just sort of reiterating those benefits when making decisions about, okay, yes, this will make it more sustainable, but we know that's not your priority. But we know that your priority is good user experience. So how will decision A over decision B, option A over option B, how will it impact user experience? And try to find that balance. Often the two are very much aligned, that the more sustainable option does deliver what the client wants. But in cases where it doesn't, then it just needs to be an open conversation and find some sort of happy compromise.
Excellent. And can you tell us a little bit more about your business in a way? So you're a B Corp, and you're adopting a business model of doing business for good. Can you tell us a little bit more about B Corps, what that is and how it's had an impact on your business?
Yeah, sure. So we've been a B Corp for 3.5 years. And it's essentially sort of it's like an overarching certification, independent certification on not just the sustainability, but also sort of the social impact of the business on workers, on society, on, how you treat the people who work in your supply chains. And I think it was best put by Guy Watson, who's the head of Riverford Organic, and they certified this week as a B Corp. And he said that they wanted to stop marking their own homework. And I think that was a good way of putting it, that, if you're committed to wanting to be a business that performs well on sustainability and social impact, then it's good to have an outside perspective of somebody who's actually helping give you some structure around how are you measuring that? Is it legitimate? Can you prove it? Or are you just, is it just a marketing thing? And it's quite rigorous. It's really, I mean, when I say it's quite rigorous, it's very difficult to go through the process. But once you've done it, I think everybody who comes through it feels like they've learned a lot and really been challenged to think about their business in new ways. And that's certainly the case for us, that we've, all of this whole journey of pursuing sort of website sustainability, although it's not actually in the B Corp assessment, in a way it was sort of catalyzed by going through that process 3.5 years ago, because it really made us think hard about, okay, like if there's, in the assessment, it's asking about like the products that you produce, and that section is basically just for people who manufacture physical goods. But we don't manufacture physical goods, so we get to skip that section, which is both a blessing and a curse, because you can't get any credit for good things, but you also don't get penalized for bad things. But we kind of felt like, well, this doesn't make any sense. Surely our work must have, our digital products must have an impact. And it really kind of catalyzed our thoughts around that and led us sort of on this journey over the last few years to look into digital sustainability.
Brilliant. So I'm getting a few questions in the comments, which is brilliant. I think if we're happy to move on to Tom's presentation, and then we'll see if we've got time for a few questions after that, if that's all right with you, Tom?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I can see some really interesting questions, so I'm very happy to jump into them in a few minutes.
Brilliant. And if you want to add any other questions while Tom's talking, while Tom's presenting, then we'll see what we can do to answer those after that session as well. So let's hear from you and your presentation about some of the key design principles in how to create those greener digital products and services.
Sure. So I'll just share my screen. And can you see that?
Yeah, that's great.
Great. So I'm going to keep this very top level because I could be here all day talking about this. And I think a lot of the detail will come out actually in some of the questions that people are asking in the chat. But I'm just going to go through top five sustainable web design tips. If you were just going to go away today and think, okay, I've learned something that I could implement, then these are sort of my top 5 tips. So my first tip is benchmark and budget. I think like anything in performance, whether it's sustainability performance or whether it's athletic performance or anything like that, it's always good to have a benchmark because it helps you focus your mind on what's possible, and it also helps you understand kind of where you are and how much room for improvement there is. So the first thing I always recommend is go and look at some key metrics of your own website. So page weight, as in the size of your web pages in kilobytes or megabytes, is a really good metric. And also you could sort of jump straight to the end and look at carbon emissions using our carbon calculator tool and just benchmark your own web pages, but also look at competitors who you think are either like your direct sort of equivalents in your market, but also people who you think might be performing really, really well, and help you understand, how good is good. So that's my first tip, to start by doing some benchmarking and find out where you sit in the market and how much better you could be. So you can use tools like our website, carbon.com, for carbon calculations. gtmetrics.com is great just for general web performance, so finding out how fast your website is, but also measuring the size of web pages in megabytes. You can look at HTTP Archive, which has sort of got loads of historical data about websites, sort of the whole of the internet, statistical data, and find out things like what is the average size of a web page on the internet this month, and compare yourself against that. And there's also a great little tool called performancebudget.io, and this is kind of the next step after benchmarking, is set yourself a budget. So if you say, okay, we're going to use page weight as our budget, and our current website is 1.5 megabytes for a single page, for example, but we think that we could get it down to 0.5 megabyte because we've seen some competitors doing that. You can actually go and look at performancebudget.io and put in some metrics that help you figure out like what's reasonable in terms of the size of a web page. So you might say, well, look, I want it to load in 3 seconds on a 3G mobile connection, and it will tell you like what's the maximum size that page could be if you're going to do that. So that helps you. Once you've benchmarked, it really helps you set a budget, and then in every decision you're making after that, you can then be kind of having a conversation around, do we think this is going to negatively impact our budget? If your budget is 500 kilobytes for the size of a web page, and you're going to put an image on that page that's 500 kilobytes, it immediately like focuses the mind on like, okay, this isn't going to work because we need room for other things. But equally, if you're going to put in a sort of 20 kilobyte image, maybe that's not a problem at all. So the next thing I'd say as a tip is to use images efficiently. So nearly all websites have images on them, and it's typically sort of the biggest thing that impacts the size of those pages. And there's many things you can do to reduce those sizes. Using less images is the obvious one, but obviously you've got to think about the flip side in terms of user experience can be enhanced by images, but you've got to ask yourself the hard question of like, does this image really add value, or is it, you know, some cheesy stock photo that doesn't really do anything for people? Or even if you are using images, like, how big do they need to be? Do they need to fill the entire screen? Or could you have the same like emotional impact on your users with smaller images that have, you know, nice space around them? So you can think about those things. You can also use alternatives to images in terms of sort of visual styling. So you can use vector graphics or illustrations that tend to be quite small file sizes. And you can also use CSS to create shapes and color and so on, instead of using photographs. So that's, that can be really, really efficient. And then if you are using photographs, optimize them as much as possible. It's amazing how many websites, you know, they have small thumbnail images on pages, but actually the image itself, if you sort of right click and open the image, is big enough to fill the whole screen. So it's being loaded big enough to fill the whole screen when actually it's only being displayed really, really small. So make sure you're loading your images at the correct size. Optimize the file format, which we'll talk about in a minute, and compress them. And I'll just run through a few things on that. So here's an example of a photograph of a horse who lives near me. And this photograph is 1.2 megabytes at full screen. So it's not straight off the camera. It's already been shrunk down to the size of my screen, but it's still 1.2 megabytes. So if I was going to just display that as it is, that's pretty big. I mean, that's much bigger than a whole web page should be. But if I halve it in size, I more than halve the file size. So if I shrink it down to, you know, half the width and half the height, then it comes from 1.2 megabytes down to 360 kilobytes as a JPEG file. But then the really interesting thing is that JPEG files size is impacted by detail in the image. So the less detail in the image, the smaller the file. So if you can blur out unnecessary detail, like in the right-hand image where I've blurred the edges of the photograph but left the middle of the image sharp, it's essentially the same photograph, but again, we've kind of getting close to halving the image size. It's now 192 kilobytes. And you can be creative with this in the design process about thinking about where can we kind of fade out detail in a way that's actually elegant, it doesn't detract the user experience. And just in general, as you know, if you're doing photography for websites, shallow depth of field tends to result in smaller image sizes. But we can take this even further. So if we make this blurred image black and white, we reduce it even further down to 129 kilobytes, because color is also another level of detail that impacts image size. So stripping out the color, if you can do that in a way that actually is on brand, can be really efficient. And then you can actually sort of change the actual file type. So JPEGs are sort of obviously standard, what you would normally think of as a photograph file type, but there's another format called WebP, which is much more efficient, and you can get plugins for your websites or online converters where you can convert JPEGs to WebP files, and without any kind of visible loss of quality. So it looks exactly the same to the user, but the file sizes are much, much smaller. And then there's also a new format, which is sort of coming out. I mean, it's already out, but not all browsers support it. But over the next couple of years, I expect to become fairly standard, which is called AVIF, which can sort of pretty much halve the file size again compared to WebP. So you can see the sort of final image is black and white, blurred edges, WebP. I've got it down to 67 kilobytes from the original full screen, full color JPEG image, which was 1.2 megabytes, which is 94% smaller than that first image. So there's lots of things you can do in images to really, really get the file sizes down. And if you think about it carefully in the design process, you can do that in a way that doesn't detract from user experience. So third tip is a very simple one. Avoid autoplay video. So although on most websites, images are kind of the biggest thing that contributes to the size of the page, that's partly because most websites don't actually have, or most web pages don't actually have videos on them. But those that do, and those that have an auto-playing one, especially those auto-playing kind of video backgrounds that you see sometimes, can really, really bloat the page. So for example, at the moment, we're working on a site where the client has asked for an auto-play video in the background. That video is 20 megabytes. And the equivalent image, you know, we can optimize that down to less than 100 kilobytes. So having a play button on a video is really makes a huge difference. Now, there are times when, you know, maybe there's a really good reason why you're going to have autoplay video, but think carefully about it, because actually in a lot of cases, if a video starts playing automatically, it's going to suck up people's bandwidth. It's could possibly slow down their device. And it's also, if it's got sound on the video, it might really embarrass them at the office when it starts playing and blurting out sound out of their laptop. So think about whether having a play button actually could enhance the user experience, but also save energy. This next one is something that people generally don't really think about, but can make quite a big difference. So custom font files on websites are real files. Like, they have significant weight to them. A typical custom font file could be, you know, 250 kilobytes, which is quite large, and that could be only a single weight. So if you want the same font in bold and maybe a kind of a lightweight version of the same font, you could be adding another 250 kilobytes for every version of the same font. So there's a few things you can do. You can use system fonts. So system fonts are the fonts that are already on the device. So every device has like Arial and a bunch of others, and it varies depending on the system. So Apple has slightly different fonts from PCs and Android, for example. But you can design in to use these, and a good example of that is like hotels.com use system fonts throughout. And I'm sure they do it for web performance reasons, that it makes their web services really fast. Then if you are using custom fonts, like, choose the right file format. So a lot of files, you sort of download them as whatever the font company gives them to you, but you can convert them. And WAF2 is like the kind of WebP of font files. It's compresses them down to the smallest size, and nobody would notice the difference. But I think the most exciting thing, and this is from a very geeky point of view, the most exciting thing you can do with fonts is to subset them, which means stripping out all of the characters that you're never going to use. So just as an example, there's a very popular open source font called InterUI, and it comes as standard with 2,192 characters covering 39 languages. So, you know, that's all, you know, it goes way beyond kind of standard Roman script. And the one file is 298 kilobytes. So subsetting that down to just UK characters, so, you know, the alphabet, 0 to 9, special characters like asterisks, exclamation mark, question mark, apostrophes, like full stops, all those really normal things that you use day to day, we get it down to 98 characters from 2,192. And without even changing the type of the file, we've shrunk it down to 12 kilobytes. And that's pretty standard. You can do that with like pretty much any font that you choose. And then if we actually convert it to a WAF2 file, we managed to get it down even further to 7 kilobytes. So subsetting fonts is really worth doing. But the only thing I'd say is just think carefully about like which characters you need. There's a bit of thought required to make sure that you haven't missed anything, especially if you're producing a website in multiple languages. And finally, so my fifth sort of top tip is use low energy colors. This doesn't impact all devices, but it impacts OLED screens. And OLED screens are the screens that you get on most modern smartphones, and increasingly on a lot of laptops, a lot of smart TVs, etc. It's sort of the new standard in screen technology. And the reason that it has a big impact is that the old screens, which the old LCD screens, basically had one big light behind them that lit up the whole screen, and then the pixels would basically just like change color in front of that big light. So the colors didn't really impact the energy consumption. OLED is very different in the sense that it's basically millions of tiny lights that light up individually. And so the color has a massive impact on how much energy the screen is using, because white is basically like turn on all the lights. Black means just leave them all switched off. And then, dark colors are kind of, you've got the dimmer switch kind of turned down. So thinking about color just from a brightness point of view, it can really make a difference on modern screens. And then weirdly, blue uses more energy. So Google did a study where they found that blue used a lot more energy on the OLED screens, 25% more than green and red pixels. So, which is part of the reason why we changed our brand colors. Our whole grain brand colors were white and blue, which was obviously a bad combination. So, so we sort of shifted it to darker colors, less blue. And that's something to really to think about. Obviously, you're restricted by brand guidelines, and if you're working with a client or a very well-known brand, you're not going to be in a position to just say, "Oh, let's stop using blue." But but it is something you can think about and see whether there's anything you can do about it. There's an increasing number of websites that have, for example, a dark mode where it kind of darkens everything down, and there's interesting things that you can do. So that's my fifth tip. And yeah, we'll go back to Fiona.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was brilliant. Really enjoyed that, and especially the images for me as well, like the amount of impact that could make and how you could reduce the energy levels was incredible. So there's a few questions in the comments that I would like to cover off on, and if anybody else would like to add some other questions, then please do. But also I just wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about web hosting as well.
Yeah, so web hosting has a big impact. It's not the whole impact. So people often talk about the carbon impact of the internet being data centers, and data centers is not the whole thing. It's like sort of about 40% of the whole picture, but 40% nevertheless is a big chunk. So there's a few things you can do in terms of thinking about your web hosting at a basic level. Finding a host that has a commitment to using renewable energy is a really good start, and they generally don't cost anymore. So there's no real sort of financial downside to doing it. So that's one thing you can do. If you look at the Green Web Foundation, they've got a kind of a big database of hosts that have registered with them to say that we've made this commitment in our data centers. So you can find a good list of hosting providers there. But then you can also, look at the intricacies of like, what is the hosting providing offer you? So a lot of hosting providers now will offer you things like server-side caching, which might be kind of jargon to a lot of people, but it basically means that they're going to pre-generate the web pages in advance before anybody tries to visit your website, so that every time somebody visits your website and a little request comes across to the server and says, I want this web page, that the server doesn't have to do lots of work in thinking about it. It already has done the work once, and now it just gives it to everybody. Whereas if you don't have that, and you haven't set up your own kind of equivalent to it, then essentially every time somebody comes to most web pages, the server has to effectively rebuild the page from scratch for every visitor, which makes the website slow because you have to wait for the server to think, but it also is just wasting energy unnecessarily. So that's like one key thing that on a kind of technical level that is really worth looking for.
Great, thank you very much for that. So I'm going to move on to the questions in the comments. So the first, I'm just going to do them in order. So the first one is from Tim Walpole, and it's he'd be interested to see how the carbon calculator can take into account how the website is generated Jamstack versus Hungry Compute powered servers, as well as how deploying with caching into edge locations affects the eco footprint.
Sure. So I should probably explain the question to to people who are not familiar with the terms. Yeah. So essentially, what Tim's asking is that there's a way of generating websites where, similar to what I just said about caching, where you sort of pre-generate these pages, you actually kind of go one step further, where the server really doesn't have to think at all. They're just static files, and they're distributed around the world, so close to the users in what's called a CDN, Content Delivery Network. And so when a user requests something, it's literally just, I want this file, here's the file, rather than the server having to really do any thinking work at all. So he's basically asking, how can our carbon calculator compare or take into account like that technology compared to what is more of a like standard technology on a website? And the short answer, Tim, is it can't. I wish it could. We've been fiddling around with like equations in the background to kind of do that on a manual level in a spreadsheet, but at a very basic level, at websitecarbon.com, it's a sort of a public test where you can put in any URL, and there's certain things that we just can't know by looking at that URL, including, you know, is it using Jamstack behind the scenes? We don't know, so we don't factor that in.
Okay, next question. This is also from Tim. We've got, would also be interested in how the main cloud providers compare with regards to the eco-sustainability. For instance, running on AWS shows that this is a non-sustainable platform for running websites. Yeah,
sure. So, so the main cloud providers, I mean, they've all got various sustainability commitments, and they all kind of keep upping their commitments, which is good. It's really good. Amazon has, or AWS, for anybody who doesn't know, is Amazon Web Services. So it's basically Amazon's cloud hosting solution. Amazon has got a really bad rap over the last few years. They've sort of, it was brought to wide public attention a few years ago by Greenpeace that, you know, Amazon basically had very little, if any, kind of commitment to using green energy. And that most of their data centers were in places where they not only had dirty electricity, but in some cases actually had a direct feed from a coal power station to their data centers. So AWS got a really bad rap. They've done a lot in the last few years to start to improve that. They're building well, they've already built, you know, some of their own solar farms and wind farms, and also got what are called power purchase agreements with power companies, which basically means that they sign a contract which says if you build a wind farm or a solar farm, we will buy the electricity from it, which is a great way of kind of incentivizing the construction of new renewables. So AWS is getting better. You can actually, they do have on the sustainability page which regions of their network actually have those commitments. So you can actually, if you're using AWS, obviously you've got to choose a region that's near to your users. But for example, you could, if your users are in the UK, or if they're in Europe in general, that's probably a better example, then you've got a few different choices as to whether you're in AWS Ireland or I think there's one in Germany. And you can look at their list and say, like, okay, so which ones have a renewable energy commitment, and maybe move it there and select that option within their settings. But in terms of which major cloud provider has the strongest commitment, I think Google continues to kind of really lead the way. They're not perfect, but they're definitely ahead of sort of Microsoft Azure and AWS. And they just upped their commitment last week, I think, to basically say that they're going to be doing, well, they're committed to having real-time renewable energy supply by 2030. So at the moment, they have a commitment to basically what they purchase on their energy bill. In rough terms, it's a bit more complex than that, but in rough terms, what we purchase on our energy bill is renewable energy, but it doesn't really necessarily correlate with the electrons that go into the data center. Whereas what they've been trialing in their Finland data center is trying to match renewable energy supplies in real time. So it's like, okay, we need a gigawatt of power right now. Is there a gigawatt of power that we can buy this minute and next minute and every minute? And they've got it to 97%, I think, in their Finland data center, doing it minute for minute, real time. And they're basically committed now to saying they're going to do that on every data center around the world by 2030, which is basically where we need to be for all data centers around the world in the end. So it's great that they're showing that leadership.
Brilliant. So I've got another couple of questions I'm going to try and squeeze in, if that's all right, Tom. So I've got from Ben Waterfall here. We've got, how would you differentiate sustainability from cost effectiveness? A lightweight, responsive website will support greater load for a given amount of compute than one that is bloated and tardy with, I imagine that's pay-as-you-go compute, therefore efficient equals sustainable.
Yeah, exactly. So this is pay-as-you-go compute basically means what you pay for your web hosting is not like a flat monthly fee, but it's actually, you're literally paying for the amount of computation that the server does. And so you're absolutely right, Ben. The more you pursue efficiency and sustainability, the less computation is required, the cheaper your hosting bills, and the more traffic that you can basically support on a very, very small hosting cost.
Hopefully this is a quick one. So what was the name of that caching feature that would be good if web hosts offered it?
Oh, it's just server caching. I mean, there's different kind of brand names that might be used, like Varnish Cache, for example. But if you basically ask your web host whether server caching is available for your website, whatever technology you're using, that's something they'll know exactly what it means, and they'll be able to give you an answer on that.
Brilliant. So Nathan, I've got, is Greenwood your real name, as question one?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and question two is, I'm interested in the green performance of the monolithic WordPress CMS. Can it compete with static sites or SPAs?
No, it's a great question. So I think out of the box by default, obviously, what Nathan's sort of suggesting is that WordPress by default is quite inefficient in that it does require a lot of computation for every person that visits your website. There's a lot you can do to get around that, and server caching is part of that. And we've had lots of conversations with hosting companies about like how big is the energy difference between a WordPress site that's like super efficient anyway on the front end in terms of design and development, plus got really good server caching. How much worse is the WordPress site that's done really, really well compared to like a completely static site or a Jamstack site, as Tim was asking about earlier. And all of the hosts basically say, yeah, probably there's a small benefit of the static site, but it's incremental. It's not a big difference. But nobody so far that we've spoken to has found a way of measuring it. So one day somebody will find a way of measuring it, and then we'll know the answer.
I think we're going to have to draw the questions to an end there, but what I will try to do is see if we can answer them in the resources section, anything else that kind of comes up. But move now to key actions to get started. So I think the main thing to remember with any of this is that it's a journey and you need to start somewhere. So I've asked Tom for his top 3 tips on things you can do right now and ways you can get started.
Sure. So in terms of getting started with digital sustainability, if it's kind of a new thing, I'd say just start by introducing it into the conversation with whoever it is. So whether you're kind of part of an in-house team or whether you work with clients, start just talking about it and explaining that this is something that should be thought about in the project. Because I think the awareness of digital sustainability is very, very low. And so, there's no point jumping straight to like technical solutions if people don't even know it's a thing. So talking about it and raising awareness amongst the people that you work with, I think is a great first step. The second thing that I would say is very much sort of like my first tip in my presentation is like sort of find out where you are now. So if you're looking at whether it's websites or whether it's kind of other digital services that you're involved with, see what you can do to get a sense of how sustainable they are. Look at the hosting and where, you know, how green is your hosting provider. Look at the sort of the efficiency of your design and development. And if it is a website, you know, you can use a tool like websitecarbon.com to test that and get a sense of that and benchmark it. So just get a sense of where you are. Maybe you're doing really, really well and, you know, there's not much to do. Or maybe you'll learn that, oh, there are lots of things that we need to do, but now we're aware of it, we can gradually kind of chip away at them when we're able to. And then my third thing is basically just start by picking one thing. Like, no, there is no perfect solution. And I think if we all start with one thing and say, look, you know, maybe you say, I'm going to optimize my images. That's a great start. Or you might say, I'm going to optimize my fonts, or you might say, I'm going to switch my hosting. That might be your first step. But just doing one thing is a step forwards. And once you've done that one thing, then you can pick up the next thing. So yeah, I'd really say talk to people, start the conversation, figure out where you are at, and how sustainable you are currently, and then just start the journey. Just take some action is always good.
Thank you. I think that's so important, that it's just that first step. You know, a lot of this can feel overwhelming sometimes in terms of how to make a difference, but there's lots of ways to do it, and it is just a lot of times that first step. So Tom, thank you so much for joining us and taking part. It's been a really useful session. I'm getting some great feedback in the comments already, which is great. Can you tell us a little bit more just about what your offer is and how people can get in touch with you?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I'm always happy to talk about anything to do with sustainability and technology and things. So if anybody ever wants to get in touch, our website is wholegraindigital.com, where you can find out kind of all about what we do at Wholegrain. You can find us on Twitter at eatwholegrain, or you can just send me an email, tom@wholegraindigital.com, or find me on LinkedIn, Tom Greenwood. There's a lot of Tom Greenwoods, and I'm not the only one that runs a web design agency, but I'm more than happy to hear from people and have interesting conversations.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, this session's been run by Make Impact. So if you'd like to find out more about how your organisation could be purpose-led or how you can make yourself a force for good, then do get in touch. You can visit our website at makeimpact.co.uk, email me directly at fiona@makeimpact.co.uk, or it's Fiona Ras Jones, and that's a little bit of a funny one on LinkedIn. It's RAS-Jones. But again, I'd love to have a chat with anyone here. That'd be great to hear about what you learned, what you got from it, what you might want more of, and that kind of leads me on as well to the feedback form. So I'm going to put the link in the comments now. We would love to hear what you thought of the event, what could be better, what future topics you'd be interested in hearing from. And if you complete it, then we will send you the resources from the session, which will include our slides, but also some other links and resources as well, that in addition to that. So I'm also running an event next Friday as part of Leeds Digital Festival called How to Engage Customers with Purpose. That's going to feature Amy Williams from Goodloop. If you'd like to sign up to that, it'd be great to see you there as well. And you can find that on the Leeds Digital Festival website. So thanks again, Tom, and to everyone for attending. It's been a great session. Cheers.